Well, let me go ahead and start. I know people are still joining, but our time is short and our content is much on this. My name is Larry Cooley, and it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to the session today. I think you'll find it as interesting as we found it interesting preparing it. I'll give you just a little bit of background for those of you who are new to the community of practice. This community of practice is now about 6 years old. We've had, I bet, several hundred of these webinars in a total of 9 working groups. There are 6 of those working groups are sectoral working groups, and the other 3 are cross-cutting. This one on monitoring and evaluation. There's one on scaling up in fragile states, and there's one on social enterprise. The other 6 are sectoral. There's one in education, there's one in health, there's one in nutrition, there's one in agriculture, there's one in youth employment, there's one in climate change. The community of practice is totally free. It's totally voluntary. Any of you who are not already members are certainly welcome to join. Just reach out to me or via the website, and we'll be happy to have you. This particular session is sponsored by the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group that John Floretta and I chair, and it's also co-sponsored by the Education Working Group that Jenny Perlman-Robinson from Brookings and Gail Simon from MSI co-chair. I want to get just a tiny sense, although I know there's still people joining, the distribution of people that are on the call. So let me ask Natalie if she would to flash up 2 little questions. One is whether people are new or not to the community of practice. The other is what walk of life you happen to be in. Okay, so that. Welcome to those of you who are new to us, and welcome back to those of you who have been with us for a while. And secondly, the sector you represent.
Oh, and this is in the chat. Is that right, Larry? This is
well, and mine is right in the middle of the screen, but if you don't see it in the middle of the screen, it's in the chat. Sorry.
Gotcha.
Thank you again. It's a heavy NGO representation, which is interesting to me, and quite a large private sector representation as well. That means we guessed about right in terms of preparing for this. It would have been some quick footwork if we guessed wrong, so I'm happy we got it more or less right. Let me give you a sense as to whether this group has been before and how this particular session fits into a trajectory, both past and future. As those of you who've been part of us from the beginning will remember, we started about 6 years ago with a series of topics that were of interest to one or another of us. There was one session, for example, on how to most effectively use case studies as part of scaling. There was another one on how to budget for monitoring, evaluation, communications, and learning if it was related to scaling or to pilot projects. There was another one on the trade-off between fidelity and adaptation, just to give you the flavor of some of these. Then pretty soon into that process, we normalized around a 3-tier framework. Natalie, could you put that up for a second? So the 3 tiers, nothing particularly revolutionary about this, but it helped us a lot, is to say if you look at monitoring and evaluation in the context of scaling, you can think about it in terms of these 3 tiers. The first tier being different sorts of studies and analytics that relate to proof of concept. And our conclusion was, although there's always more work to be done, that our community was on balance getting much better at that and was pretty good at it. Tier 2 had to do with all of the kinds of analytics and monitoring and evaluation that related to improving models, preparing them for scale, assessing their scalability, making them more available for scale in a rigorous or at least analytically credible way. And we came to the conclusion as a group that we were, as a community, not nearly as good at that as we were at the proof of concept kind of work. And then tier 3 was the kind of information systems and flows that are necessary to support change management. And that had to do with both the monitoring of the scaling up process itself, but also how to ensure that you are continuing to have the kinds of effects at scale and making the improvements that you needed along the way in order to ensure that. You can take that down now, Natalie. We decided then as a group that the right thing for us to do was to really focus on tiers 2 and 3, not because tier 1 couldn't use more work as well, but because we felt there was much more work to do in the scaling context around Tier 2, which is really preparing things for scale and assessing scalability, and Tier 3, which was actually the monitoring and evaluation that needs to take place during the scaling process. And we've been, for the last 3 or 4 years, trying to drill down in those two respective tiers. We started with Tier 2, and we had a session on scalability assessment. I'm mentioning these because all of these are archived for any of you who weren't part of it and are interested. And then we started to think about also interesting ways that rigorous analysis of an RCT sort or something approximating that could be amended to be applicable for Tier 2 and Tier 3, not only for Tier 1 proof of concept. We then took stock again. Where are we in the process of monitoring and evaluation and its relationship to scaling? And we said, okay, let's pick one topic that seems to concern a lot of us, and let's hang on it till we really feel like we break the back of that problem. And the problem we picked is this notion of how to track institutionalization of change. And we started with a proposition that said, look, you can think of the information flows around scaling as being in 3 broad buckets. One has to do with efficacy, one has to do with coverage, and the third one has to do with institutionalization. Again, we're better at 2 of them than we are at the third. We're pretty good at efficacy. We're pretty good at coverage. We're probably best at coverage. And we're pretty bad at institutionalization. So we said, okay, let's double down on institutionalization. This session is the first of 4 on the topic of institutionalization. What do we mean by institutionalization? How do we track it? What role does information and evidence play in trying to move it forward? And to that end, we thought it was useful to start with some normalizing around it, which is why we distributed the toolkit, and particularly tool 13 in the toolkit, which is the institutionalization tracker. That itself comes on the heels of a series of efforts by others to try to pull together this notion of institutionalization. There was a lot of work done in the health community on this issue. Brookings has been and continues to be involved on the education sector side. Others have advanced other pieces of this. My colleagues and I at MSI pulled together what we had done before and what others had done into that tool number 13, which takes the notion of institutionalization, disaggregates it into 5 different subcategories and a total of 11 dimensions, sets up a maturity model and a way to sort of track that over time. I don't pretend it's more rigorous than it is, but we found it very useful, both as a way to talk about institutionalization and as a way to track it from a monitoring and evaluation point of view. John and I decided we would then try to drill down on those with case examples. And so today is the first of those 4, and our speakers from Young Love and from Educate are going to give us a sense of what institutionalization looks like in their efforts, which both are in the education sector. The next session we're going to have, which is about a month from now, will focus on the health sector. And we're starting agnostic about how similar or different that may be from education, but that's one of the questions we want to interrogate. The third session is going to look at the issue of institutionalization and monitoring and evaluation of institutionalization from a donor perspective. And the fourth is going to step back from all of that and try to see what might this look like from the point of view of the host country government, since a lot of this institutionalization takes place into government structures. Then we're going to take that whole bundle of 4, try to synthesize across that any lessons learned, any revisions to tools that we might want to make on the strength of that, and bring that forward into what will be the Community of Practice's annual meeting scheduled for November of this year. So the idea is that this is a learning series that we hope will be able to bring together into a knowledge product that all of us can use in whatever ways make most sense for us.
Direct your email to the office of the president now.
I'm going to now, if I could, hand over to John just by way of thanking him both for serving as co-chair with me on this committee and planning this series, and also for moderating today's discussion with Young Love and with Educate. John, over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to have the chance to welcome colleagues from Educate and from Young Love. So from Educate, we have Megan Mahoney, who is the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation for Educate. And she's going to start off and present on their work institutionalizing skills program in Rwanda, working with the Rwandan government over the last 6 years. And then
John, I'll interrupt just to tell you, I don't know if your video is not working or you didn't turn it on, but we see a big circle with a JF instead of you.
Oh, interesting. Okay, let's try that. Is that better? And then the second, we've got Shepi and Noam from Young Love, both co-founders from Young Love, who have been working with the government of Botswana to institutionalize a foundational learning program. And we've seen both presentations. They're going to be very excellent. So I thought what we would do is Megan will kick us off, present for about 20 minutes. Then we'll turn over to Shepi and to Noam, and we'll also present for 20 minutes. And I'll have a couple questions for them, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. If you have questions, you can write them in the chat or raise your hand when we get to Q&A. Let's just go ahead and kick off. So Megan, with no further ado, over to you.
Great, thanks, John. Let me share my screen. Can I get a verbal confirmation that you guys can see what I'm looking at? All right, great. Fantastic. Well, good morning and afternoon, everyone. As John mentioned, I'm Megan Mahoney. I'm the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation at Educate. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing to integrate skills-based education into the education systems in the countries that we work in. We believe that skills and an emphasis particularly on application and practice form the foundation of secondary education. And I want to show you today how we've been able to integrate that into the education system, the results of the work, and how we track that institutionalization. To orient you briefly about Educate, we prepare youth in Africa with the skills to succeed in today's economy. We tackle this and the problem of youth unemployment by partnering with youth, schools, and governments to design and deliver solutions to equip young people in Africa with the skills to attain further education, overcome gender inequities, start businesses, get jobs, and generally drive development in their communities. And our vision is to design skills-based education and employment solutions that measurably impact millions of youth across Africa each year. So first, I want to set the context of the challenge and the policy issue that we're trying to address. In the context where we work, the youth population is large and growing rapidly. We know that about 90% of youth will end up working in the informal sector, and the only way to reach youth at scale is through the secondary education system. But that system, as it currently exists, is poorly suited to prepare youth for the realities of the labor market that they will face. And the results that it has produced are kind of separated from life outcomes. And we believe that we need to do better. Our goal from the start has been to create a skills-based approach to youth education that is directly tied to life outcomes, such as soft and transferable skills and some of the other outcome categories I mentioned before. In 2009, Educate has partnered with, again, youth, schools, and governments across Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya to design and deliver solutions which can help prepare youth with the skills that they need to succeed in life after school. Today, we're the largest youth skills provider in East Africa, each year serving about 46,000 new youth with our evidence-based models. And that model is based on a 100-hour experience delivered during post-primary or high school level education that helps youth develop skills, mostly transferable skills, that they need to transition successfully from education into the labor market. And we think about scaling this experience in two ways. First, through the education system, and secondly, through boot camps to serve out-of-school youth. And today I'm going to talk to you about how we do the first, scaling through education systems. So how do we scale our approach through the education system? I'll speak to our progress thus far using examples from our work in Rwanda as we work to scale an institutionalized skills-based education in partnership with the Rwandan government. But before I talk about the specifics, I want to introduce the framework that we use to achieve systems change. So we work to achieve systems change through 3 basic stages, no matter the context. First, we want to change policy. We mainly do this through technical advisory support. This means ensuring that the curriculum and national curriculum in the context that we work in includes a focus on key transferable skills that we know are necessary for life after school, as well as pedagogical guidance for how teachers can run their classrooms to encourage skill development. Stage 2 involves support to roll out those curriculum reforms or those policy reforms. In our experience, this involves training and supporting teachers to execute the new policy. And we work very hard to integrate this work into the existing in-service training structures in the context where we're supporting the rollout of these new policies. And then finally, we work to create structures to support and reinforce the change. For us, we really think about the incentives that exist in the system and how these existing incentives can be used to encourage adoption, but also what new structures could create new incentives that would encourage teachers and schools and education in general, the education system in general, to adopt these policies and make these changes. Right now, we're working to scale through the education system in 2 countries, Kenya and Rwanda. And today I'm going to focus on our work to support the education system in Rwanda. So as John mentioned, we've been doing this work for about 6 years. We started working with the Rwanda Education Board, the government agency that oversees curriculum and teacher development, in 2015. In an effort to create lasting change, we partnered with the Rwanda Education Board to update the National Upper Secondary Entrepreneurship curriculum. The entrepreneurship subject is a required course for secondary students, in our upper secondary students in this context. And this curriculum reform was part of a broader competence-based curriculum reform that included all subjects and education levels from pre-primary all the way through upper secondary. The result of this technical advisory work means that the curriculum that was introduced in 2016, the revised curriculum, now includes components of Educate's core approach, like our hands-on skills lab pedagogy, which is a vehicle for active learning pedagogies, student business clubs, which provide an avenue for students to apply the skills that they're learning in the classroom, outside the classroom, as well as practical assessments that we call portfolios. And this aspect of education reform now reaches every student who moves through the upper secondary education system in Rwanda. We followed this technical advisory support with teacher training and support model called the Educate Exchange program, which was meant to serve as the reform rollout support. It was designed to integrate into the existing in-service teacher training structure. Training was delivered by district master trainers who were themselves trained by Educate. And today we've trained through this structure about 55% of secondary schools on the new curriculum. And then the third stage is where we are now. We're still working to install the best tools and structures to ensure that the support lives sort of beyond Educate's intervention and really make sure that it continues to reinforce and encourage the adoption and use of these practical or these active pedagogies that are included in the reformed curriculum, which is our ultimate aim. So before I talk about that sort of third step where we are now in our efforts to institutionalize, I want to talk a little bit about the results we've achieved so far. Our first step in tracking institutionalization was a step that Larry mentioned earlier, ensuring that we had the evidence or the proof of concept that the policy form was actually able to be rolled out. To learn about the impact of the system level approach on students, in 2016, we partnered with researchers from Oregon State University, the World Bank, and Innovations for Poverty Action, as well as the Rwanda Education Board and Akazi Kanozi Access to launch a randomized evaluation to study the impact of this Educate Exchange teacher training and reform rollout support program. The study was funded by JPAL's Post-Primary Education Initiative, as well as IGL and IZA. At its core, this program really aims to strengthen the tie between teacher professional development and youth life outcomes. And the study aimed to measure whether or not we achieved that through this cascading training model. So we followed up 6 months before graduation and 6 months after high school graduation with the cohort of students who moved through upper secondary school beginning when the reform was introduced, to answer the question, did the Educate Exchange program change government teacher pedagogy? And does that teacher pedagogy translate into significant impact on student life outcomes, such as skills, education outcomes, and economic activity? And what did we learn? I want to share the results from the study, which provides really for us the foundational evidence that demonstrates that the early success we've had at institutionalizing our model and achieving system level impacts through the system. We found that we were able to shift pedagogy. Teachers were more likely to use active learning pedagogies that were at the center of the curriculum reform and covered in the training. And this pedagogy did shift some this pedagogy shifted student experiences, which in turn shifted some student outcomes. So we actually saw some impressive impacts on girls. 6 months after secondary school, we saw large improvements in university enrollment, a pretty sizable increase in self-employment, as well as a decrease in whether or not youth were NEET or not in education, employment, or training. And for boys, we saw impacts, but really feel like there's some room for improvement. So overall, we did see an increase across the both genders in university enrollment. But for boys particularly, there seemed to be some trade-off between wage employment and self-employment. So overall, these results really gave us real hope on the potential to create impact through the system and gave us some information and a roadmap on how to improve our ability to do so. We saw that an effective program run through the system can improve student outcomes, but we're eager to advance to the next stage, which is really installing and strengthening the incentives in the system and tracking our progress. So now I want to talk a little bit about how are we tracking and measuring our institutionalization. Whether we're thinking about which incentives and support structures to install in a system to sustain change or how to measure and track success, we keep this key design principle at the center of our strategy. And it's really that structures are more important than training, and that you have to think about the work you're doing in stages 1 and 2 is setting up for sustainable changes and sustainable structures from the beginning. And this is something that I think the institutionalization tracker in the toolkit also can help us do, as it really charts out what the ideal end state is and some of the steps that we have to take along the way. But what does that mean in practice? For each structural change we knew was needed to reorient the education system to tie education directly to life outcomes, because that is our goal, and help youth develop the practical skills that they need to succeed in life after school, we need to map that change first to a policy change, but then also ensure that we had some sort of end game, a structure that would reinforce compliance and adoption at the end. So as you can see here, the 3 key elements, this table lists the 3 key elements that we wanted to see included in the policy, whether or not they were included in the policy, and then our work to think about the sustainability strategy. What is that structure that we're institutionalizing at the end? And so in the 3rd column, we kind of have like a brief assessment of where we are on these various sustainability strategies. The example here for the training, where we kind of have the sort of equals sign here, it was designed, the training program that we designed and rolled out was designed to support the adoption of these new pedagogical approaches. We've had some partial success when we think about system integration. We did successfully shift teacher pedagogy, but a key learning from running that reform rollout support program was that even if NGO staff train teachers, even if it's in line with government policy, it's seen as an NGO initiative. So one of the key learnings for us as we move forward is to think about how we can really be even more aggressive with the delivery going through government actors when we're thinking about training teachers in schools to actually adopt what's in the policy. I want to do a deeper dive to focus on some key learnings and progress around 2 of the other sustainability structures we're attempting to install. One is a monitoring framework designed to manage and encourage compliance, where you see the red X. And then the second is a system that will link practical skills-based assessments to the national exam to act as an incentive for teachers to continue to adopt these practices. First, our work on management practices. The challenge that we saw was that we wanted to address, or the challenge that we wanted to address was really that we needed to identify an actor within the system who could help manage teachers to that policy. Theoretically, head teachers should see the pedagogical standards in the curriculum, but without follow-up from other system actors, there was really little incentive for them to enforce and support their teachers to adopt. District education officials could actually, in our assessment, play that role. They could be the people who were visiting schools to follow up and encourage teachers, we thought. And it would be much more effective than educate team members doing this, and much more sustainable. That could be the structure that we kind of were designing towards. Plus, because they already had some school monitoring responsibilities, this might not feel sort of totally outside of what they're used to doing. So we designed a possible solution and a way to track how well it was working. And this possible solution was what we called district monitoring letters. We had district officials who had existing monitoring responsibilities take a second form with them to when they visited secondary schools to assess the schools and the teachers on how well they were doing at adopting various activities that were included in the competency-based curriculum reform. And you can see a picture of this form here. These officials would then fill out the form and then deliver the results in a letter to the head teacher. Ideally, this letter was also supposed to include some some areas for improvement or ways that they could improve their adoption. And in parallel, we also worked with a coalition of other development partners who were also advocating for improvements in sort of the district monitoring framework. We ran this for about a year, or like one full academic year, and we learned some important lessons. So through tracking both the circulation of these letters as well as visiting a sample of schools to kind of speak with head teachers and teachers to hear about how the process was going, we learned a few key things. And mainly it was that this wasn't really the right structure to encourage adoption. District monitoring officials in this case weren't really the right actor to collect and give feedback on pedagogy. Their existing monitoring responsibilities were so focused mostly on infrastructure and school-wide issues that this was kind of stepping out of what the focus of that monitoring visit. And because they had a focus on infrastructure and school-wide issues, integrating subject-specific asks was kind of difficult to integrate into their process. It ended up being a thing that the system sort of cared less about because it was subject-specific, and so the structure stopped at a certain level. We also realized that teachers needed coaches, not police. Just telling teachers and head teachers how they were doing did little to actually help them grow and adopt. And so another actor kind of needed to be in charge of that. We also found that it was a bit difficult to coordinate amongst a coalition of a variety of development partners who all were working on different subjects at different levels. And it was difficult to sort of reach a consensus because there were so many diverse interests represented in that coalition. So this led us to shift our attention to a different sustainability structure, focused more on accountability and incentives, which is linking continuous skills-based assessments in classrooms to the national exam. In our context, the national exam is still one of the biggest things that people look to when they're thinking about the success of the education system or the success of any given school or teacher. So we know that they look at those scores as a way of assessing their progress and quality. We had succeeded in making sure that our continuous assessment model was integrated into the curriculum. So we have a check mark in the policy column. And we also had more minor policy documents that articulated that these assessments were supposed to make up a portion of students' grades. We also successfully integrated portfolios into the active pedagogy rolled out through the training. And the final piece really was setting up structures and a system to get grades from the teachers and integrate them into the national exam score. So that's what we're working on right now. Currently, we're collaborating with our government partners to build the technology and information systems whereby teachers can actually take the grades that they're assigning to these portfolio assignments and upload them into a national system. And we're planning to pilot training that will help teachers adopt and use continuous assessment. And then we'll use that to inform broader rollout. Again, always thinking about what we learned with the initial teacher training that we did is how can we make sure that government actors are really kind of in the driver's seat and seen as the people kind of enforcing this change. And as we work to link continuous assessments to the national exam, we'll be looking to establish the following things. And these are terms taken from the institutionalization toolkit. First, we want to look at governance, particularly from the policy angle. Is the national policy clear, and is it communicated in a way that teachers and schools understand what they're supposed to do? Second, what does the coordination from a governance perspective look like? Was the policy and the implementation guidance announced or publicized through a mandate? Is it clear that it is required? Then thinking about sort of the accountability. Are there standards? What are the tools and standards that provide the implementation framework, which in our context is pretty important? The national government tends to issue implementation frameworks, which I think really do help provide guidance and make it clear, how they're actually supposed to roll out these policies. And then thinking of it from a monitoring, evaluation, and learning perspective, also within accountability, who's tracking the use of these tools? Is someone paying attention to how many teachers are uploading scores onto this system? And are there consequences for non-compliance? So going back to our model for delivering student level outcomes through the system, each stage in our process comes with some measure of success, which I've talked a little bit about through this, but I want to consolidate it just so it's really clear how we track institutionalization. It was key for us to articulate what we wanted to achieve and how we know we've arrived from the start so that we had a sense of sort of the end goal. And this table shows kind of how we define success at each stage, as well as how the definition of success maps to the institutionalization tracker and the scaling up toolkit. So going through the stages, during stage 1, when we are providing technical assistance for policy change and curriculum reform, we expect policy documents to include key changes. These documents don't just include the major policy documents like the curriculum, which is very, very important, but also supporting documents like manuals and textbooks. So this is referred to under the government dimension in the institutionalization tracker. And as we see at the bottom in this stage, we also start to look for some accountability and learning structures in the form of standards. For us, we've looked to see that the national government distributes implementation frameworks, like I mentioned before, which include standards for rollout. Stage 2, we look to ensure the government actors train and support or are as involved as possible in training and supporting the reform as it's rolled out. This is, again, an area where we've had some wins and some big learnings, but we're really leaning in to ensure that the government actors are the ones who own and deliver the reform rollout support. And then in stage 3, we want to see that management and accountability structures exist. Specifically, we're looking for compliance structures. Do structures for tracking compliance exist? Are there consequences for non-compliance? Are they clear? And underlying this again is, are there clear standards and tools for implementation related to these systems? So before I leave you today, I want to summarize a few of the key learnings that we have that we think have been important in our journey working in Rwanda. First is that policies matter. Changing policy and related documents, both major and minor, is an essential first step, and it matters a lot in places with a national curriculum. Second is you really need to mobilize the correct actor. Monitoring and management of implementation could work, but it requires the right actor and might not address, and if you don't use the right actor, it might not actually address the need. And so in our case, district officials weren't the right actor. They had, their focus was on school-wide issues, and they were not necessarily the right people to give the support that teachers needed, in addition to telling them whether or not they were adhering to the curriculum. Third, accountability is key. Sustainability structures should have some way of enforcing accountability, and the consequences of non-compliance really should be clear. And then finally, partial success is still measurable progress. There's an intermediate step that shows your work is getting traction for us that I haven't talked about yet, but that has been really important for us as we thought about integrating into the government system. And that's sort of requests for support or help from the system. So is the government reaching out to ask us to advise on a pre-service teacher training process? Or has the government cited Educate's work as best practice or an example of success? That's not necessarily full institutionalization, but it does show that the government actors see Educate as a supportive partner who could help further their own mission, and allows us to sort of help think about what are other structures in the system aside from the ones that are directly in our line of sight that we could use to actually institutionalize some of this process. So that's all I have for you today. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share our experience. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, and I'll pass it back to John.
Thanks so much, Megan. That was fascinating, and I'll ask Noam and Mochepi to set up their presentation in the background now. A quick, comment. I just think it's so interesting that in addition to the direct service model, which is I think your Educate's boot camp model, you have this systems model, and you've got 6 years of experience trying to figure out what has worked and what's been more complex. It'll come up in, I think, in what Sheppy and Noam are going to present. I think this idea that we're trying to collaborate with governments to mainstream innovation. We know that the policy is needed but not sufficient. We know that training teachers for behavior change in classrooms is needed but not sufficient. And so it kind of gets into this teacher behavior change. How do you get there? The sense that monitoring and coaching is integral, but then who's going to do it? Is the district official the right person? Is a block official? Is someone in the school? There's pros and cons to all of that. I would love to dive into that a little bit more. And I really like your point on links to accountability, and ideally accountability that matters to people in the education system. So these national exams seem very, if you could link to progress towards those, seems very important. And I'll be curious to learn more about on the process indicators. Do people track it? Do people treat this program as different than their other programs? Should they, if we care about mainstreaming? And we'll come to that a little bit later. So thanks so much, Megan. And now I'd like to pass over to the leadership of Young Love to share their experience in Botswana.
That's great. Thanks, everyone. So I'm just going to also a verbal confirmation. Can you see the screen here?
Indeed.
You can. Awesome. I can't see myself. I can see John, but that's good, actually. Then it's there's an audience. So, that's great. Thank you, everyone. We're going to dive in and share some lessons from Botswana, some very similar to what Megan shared from Educate. Just a quick context on Young Love. We are the largest NGO in Botswana and one of the larger ones in Southern Africa. And our mission is to connect youth to proven life-saving information. Our starting point is often evidence. So we actually start from programs that have already been shown to work in RCTs in health and education. And our vision is all youth thriving. So all our programs are by youth for youth, focused on young people. And we work hand in hand with the government. So in addition to having memorandums of understanding, being a close partner, Tepi also is the chairperson of the government's National Youth Council. So really we're sort of hand in glove with government in everything we do. So just a context for the program we're going to talk about, which I imagine many of us know, but there is a global learning crisis. So many students are in school, but they're not learning. So in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, 3/4 of students cannot read a basic sentence such as the name of the dog is Puppy. So they've been in school for 3 years and they can't read this. In Botswana, the situation is also very dire. And we did an assessment, a census of 2 regions. Only 10% of kids can do basic 2-digit division, for example, which is the minimum grade level expectation in grade 5. So many students are in school and just not acquiring foundational numeracy and literacy skills. But there is a promising reform, which I imagine many on the call are familiar with, targeting instruction. And the basic idea is that school systems are typically structured by grade, so they're kind of organized in this horizontal way. But if you actually look at what kids know, this is an example from numeracy, whether they know no operations, addition or subtraction, multiplication or division, you can see it's all over the map. And typically the curriculum is targeted at the top here. Let's say multiplication and division in these grades. You can see you're missing most kids. 85 to 90% of kids aren't at that level. Yet we organize the school system in this way. That's the system, that's the structure, right? We organize schools by grade. And so the basic idea is to flip this and organize it by what kids know. This is a very simple idea, but a very radical idea at the same time, and it's been very effective in many randomized trials. So that's the backdrop to this. I remember at the beginning of this journey, actually, the Deputy Permanent Secretary of Botswana said, I wish actually we could just eliminate grades and totally restructure the system. But of course, that's easier said than done. So, but we've done our best to get to that ideal, and I'll describe a couple lessons in that journey. So prior to COVID, we actually had managed to deliver teaching at the right level, this approach, in 20% of primary schools in the country in Botswana, and we're on a fast track to reaching 100% of primary schools. And we are also, in addition to our work in Botswana, an innovation hub for a scale-up effort of teaching at the right level across Africa in partnership with Pratham J-PAL Tall Africa, and also with Brookings as part of the Real-Time Scaling Labs effort. You can see the whole coalition here, including UNICEF in Botswana, the government of Botswana, USA DIV is supporting this work, and many others. So quite a broad coalition around this effort. We've got two main models, though I will say this is simplified. It's a messier in practice, in a good way, actually, and I'll describe what that means. So we have a direct delivery model, and we've intentionally chosen to keep this very contained. So we actually are a very large NGO. We could reach many more schools than this, but we've chosen to keep it to 50 schools. And the reason is we want this direct delivery to serve a particular purpose, which is to catalyze, to spark, to show proof of concept in what's possible, and to be an engine for innovation testing. We actually do randomized A/B testing every term here, where we tweak the model, we make it simpler, we make it cheaper, we make it more scalable. We've got some super interesting insights from that. So this is sort of where the direct delivery is. And it also serves as a fertilizer. So it actually rotates every term, and then the school picks it up from there with their teachers, with their teacher aides, their national service program. So it really is that catalyst and that spark. And then we all have the government-led model where 90% of schools are delivering entirely government-led. So this is scalable, sustainable, and you can continue to actually innovate here and refine the model. So I wanted to kind of emphasize that it's not like there's no innovation happening in the government model. That's also happening. Often it's more about institutionalization and structures and scalability. So that's the basic idea. The reason I said it was a bit messier is the government is so invested in this, actually. They pay for a large proportion of the direct delivery as well. So all the trainings for direct delivery are funded by the government in government facilities with government leaders. So this is sort of a frame, but actually they're actually more blurry in a good way in practice. So that's the idea. I'll hand it over to Tepi to share some of the lessons on tracking of institutionalization, then I'll pick back up later on. So over to you, Tepi. Let me know if you can jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Tell me when to click, Tepi, and I'll click through.
Yeah, I will just say next and then you can click. Thank you so much, Noam, and everyone for joining this call. Just really excited that, we're opening this conversation in the first series. So thank you also, John, for sharing the institutionalization tracker. This is just an example of the work that we also did with the Brookings Institution to look at particularly how far we are along in terms of institutionalization of teaching at the right level. And really very much we have made significant progress on this front, but also there's always more to do. As you can see, we will give two particular examples of how far we have come. One represents a score of low institutionalization, as well as 4 looking at full institutionalization. So we'll give examples on our leadership as well as the human resources personnel on who's actually delivering teaching at the right level within the government system. Now we can turn to the next slide. So we're giving an example about a region, particularly in the Northeast, and where we have seen really, government taking it on at all levels. So we found that, 80% of students are really learning foundational skills in numeracy. We find that these results are persistent and consistent throughout their journeys on teaching at the right level. Next, no. We can also find that within the government system, there is really strong leadership from the regional director. And he's very much a true champion on teaching at the right level. He is the one organizing the training, coordinating with school heads, and ensuring that the program is moving, and really asking his team to report on a quarterly basis on teaching at the right level. We also have been able to support the ministry with seconding the Young Love staff to the ministry, providing technical assistance. So we do have teams that are embedded and sitting next to the regional director's office and closely working very much on teaching at that level on a day-to-day basis. We're also finding for us to move to institutionalization, there needs to be a strong ownership. So an example of this is that there is a person sitting at all regions that we're working in that's fully assigned to doing level work. So this ensures that the program doesn't necessarily get lost between the many things that are happening in government, but again, there is that control and ownership from the government. Another example, right, that we've been able to see happening in the Northeast is that now government is in charge of collecting the data, but actually using the data to now make decisions on how far wide teaching at the right level should move. So we are collecting data every 30 days. And review meetings. So what you find in Northeast is that the regional director will set up a meeting with the various school heads to actually present the results. And it's been remarkable for us to be able to see this happen at regional level, as well as at headquarter level, where now government is appreciating the evidence and the strong results on teaching at the right level. As I also mentioned, in addition to having a point person, we are finding that the teaching at the right level, particularly with the principal education officers, is that when they report, as well as when they are planning doing their professional development plan, they have teaching at the right level as a key target for them to report against. So often at times, this may look different in different regions, but to have teaching at the right level, enshrine that one sentence to say that report on TAL milestones has been very key, because, it keeps them accountable and ensuring that they see this as their day-to-day practices. Another example that we've seen on institutionalizing TAL is that, as very much looking at the structure within government, the trainings, right, are very much government-led, but again, involving many stakeholders at various departments. And I think this has been a very important lesson for us to ensure that all the principal education officers, the government point people on teaching at the right level, as well as teachers and the National Service Program participants are trained, and as well as ensuring that, at all levels, there is some sort of involvement. And this has been very key to ensuring that we're institutionalizing. And then just lastly to share, that we have seen consistent implementation over the period of 2 years, even during COVID-19. What is very interesting is that, we always talking about government ownership and how it looks like at the end state. When schools shut down in March 2020, and then we came back, just a few months after that, the government in Northeast was like, we are ready to move. What are we waiting for? Even though despite, the double shift system, they're actually pushing for implementation to happen, while some other regions have stalled due to the changing, government systems. So another example that we also just share, this is also from our regions on human resources. As Noam mentioned, we are delivering teaching at the right level with both the National Service Program participants. These are young people that already are placed in schools, but also, again, very much, used to be involved in, usual work such as sports activities, but not necessarily teaching. But we've been able to work with the ministry to ensure that they select and recruit the National Service Program participants that should be delivering teaching at the right level. But again, when they transition out of the National Service Program, the ministry is in charge of ensuring that there's redeployment, but also getting them back up into the system. So we are seeing that government is owning very much, who's delivering teaching at the right level, just from the selection to also ensuring that they are delivering as well as recruiting when they, drop out of the program. So we've been able to see this in all regions that we are working with. Some areas that we wish to press into is, whilst, there is strong and a sustainable, delivery model within government. This is, both for the National Service Program participants as well as teachers. we really are in the discussions of now how does this look like in future, and one of the things is, do we get the National Service Program participants to be absorbed by the Ministry of Education? Do we, how do we get them to be teacher aides? Because currently right now they're very much young people who are underqualified or sometimes have even just finished with grade 7. So the current conversations now is about long-term and where do we need to press into for our delivery model to be sustainable, but as well as thinking more about pre and service as well as in-service training for both these youthful facilitators as well as teachers. How do we embed teaching at the right level within these existing structures to ensure that there is future support? So these are the current discussions that we are having with the ministry. That's why we haven't scored on a 4, but to say that we have made significant progress, but there's still a long way to go in terms of ensuring that our personnel is fully institutionalized. So we'll again share just on the strong delivery by government, particularly on the human resources, but also just bring attention to the results that we've been able to see. As you know, we have 2 models of delivery. We have found the results from both the government and direct delivery are nearly very much effective in some regions. So the graph on my right, it shows, the decrease in numeracy, so students who cannot operate any numbers. You could see on the government delivery side that it reduced, from 33% to 14%. As well, on the direct delivery side, there are much bigger effects from 30% to 6%. But the bottom line of this slide is to show that there is significant improvement from the results on the government. Government is delivering. It has strong, performance results. But again, it's not as different as compared to our direct model. So we're seeing that these results are very much key and persistent across, some of the regions that we work with. So giving, government as well as Young Love, the hope that, something is working even within the government models. We'll also just share a little bit more on the institutionalization timeline, just to give a brief overview of how far or how long teaching at the right level has come. So as you know, teaching at the right level has over 20 years, being implemented, through 6 randomized controlled trials that have shown to work. So it's really a body of evidence showing strong results, but also motivation of why it works. And in 2017, we conducted a needs assessment in Botswana. We found through the needs assessment that 10% of grade 5 students cannot, only 10% of grade 5 students are at division level. So there's a strong need and a strong motivation in the initial beginning, in the beginning stages, to ensure that teaching at the right level actually is aligned to the ministry's needs. And then in 2018, we worked now closely with the Ministry of Basic Education as well as UNICEF Botswana to do a local proof of concept to test some of the models in government, but again, also to see the results of the program and to be able to see how we can take it over to scale. We found that, 10%, we reached 10% of all schools, but also we found, the results that persisted from other trials are still very much similar to, in Botswana, to say that teaching at the right level works and we need to move forward with it. And then in 2019, we really now got to understand the accountability frameworks. What are the things that we can put in place to ensure that government, is taking this on, but also supporting government to ensure that we are improving learning outcomes in the country. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the government. This was the first step for us to ensure that now we are having a commitment device, but also ensuring that government and Young Love are in close collaboration and partnership to be able to eventually, scale teaching at the right level across all primary schools in the country. So hence why it was a huge win. We also really saw in 2019 the government model take shape, involving teachers, involving the National Service Program participants to deliver in all the regions that we work with. And this is when government was now starting to take full ownership and control of the program. In 2020, as I've mentioned, the brilliant work has been done in Northeast. We think that's a clear example of where we've seen, high institutionalization from the government and of the program. But again, our model is getting much more stronger because, as we recall, during the pandemic, we couldn't necessarily get into schools, but we had teachers that already existed, as well as our youthful facilitators that already were placed in schools. So we had to rely on them to take on the work, particularly because there's a changing education system in the country. So we found this, to be successful in 2020. And where we currently are now, and which is an interesting conversation, is that we have renewed our MOU with the ministry and currently in conversations about how do we now take it to the next stage. So that has been exciting and encouraging. But also, again, teaching at the right level has persisted even through multiple major shocks, right? We are now finding that, right now in Botswana, there is the double shift system in the education system. So half of the students will attend school and then the other half will come in the afternoon. But we are finding that teaching at the right level, despite all the different changes that have been brought out by the pandemic, it's still very much, persisting, which is also a very important story to tell as we talk about how we transition, despite many shocks. Next slide now. Yes, this one is just to highlight more on the successes of the MOU. Teaching at the right level has seen and survived changing permanent secretaries. We have been able to also ensure that there is an 8-year commitment from the ministry. As No mentioned, we are very much a core partner with the ministry and see the success of working with government as one that we have to hold in high regard as we are looking to scale teaching at the right level in all primary schools. So we have persisted even through shocks. We have tested and being able to measure how institutionalization looks like in the long term and working closely with government. So I will hand it over to Noam to just walk us through the last stages of the slide, but also is to say thank you for this discussion. Over to you, Noam.
Thank you, Tepi. Yeah, I'll just wrap up. I know we're coming to time here. So this is quite a striking graph. You're one of the first people to see this. So it's quite striking. This is some data on the percentage of students who were enumerate right before the pandemic struck. So you can see it says months during 2020. Let me turn on my video. Months during 2020. So you can see those first few months right before March, which is month 3, enumeracy went down substantially. So from over 30% of kids who were enumerate to just under 10. This was in quite dramatic, right? So teaching at the right level working. This is in the Northeast with that North Star region. Then schools closed and you can see enumeracy rates went up. So by the time we came back into schools and delivered in full force, there was sort of spottery delivery in term 2 and then full delivery in term 3. You can see that indeed learning was lost, right? Everyone's been talking about learning loss. So that's what we saw here. Enumeracy rates went up. Interestingly, because this cohort of students got teaching at the right level before, they were still better off actually than where they were pre-pandemic, pre-TAL. That's kind of interesting. They got some, in a way, protection because they gained some skills, so they didn't lose everything actually. And they were actually still better off than they were pre-TAL. And then interestingly, TAL came into effect again, and we see numeracy rates plummet to just 5%. So this is really remarkable. This is the government. You know, we talk about building back better, but how many examples do we actually have of this? We think this is a shining one, where it happened pre-pandemic, data was collected post-pandemic to be able to target instruction and see where kids were at, and then they made major progress. So we're so blown away by the Northeast. I mean, it's just been spectacular what they've been able to do. And the regional director says in his 25 plus years, this is the single most effective education approach he's ever led. It's really quite extraordinary, that level of institutionalization. And by the way, the region, the ministry said, hey, we're collecting data. Make sure you join the bandwagon. We didn't say, hey, what's happening? I mean, it was just amazing. He said, we're doing this. Are you joining hands with us? It was just amazing. So I'm just gonna, so these are my nice animations for this, but I think we got the memo. Okay, so I'm gonna end up with this notion. I think sometimes we think about institutionalization as sort of a fixed state of the world, but we want to pose this perhaps controversial view, but that we believe in very strongly, that actually we're seeing institutionalization like the stock market. It goes up, it goes down. You know, there's shocks. Certainly COVID was one of the most historic shocks, but, you know, we had 3 permanent secretaries. I can't tell you the amount of shock that generated. You know, that was similarly shocking. And there's always shocks. I mean, anytime something is with government, it's a bit political, right? There's nothing stable about politics. And so our view around institutionalization is it goes up and down, but as long as it goes up, the trend, you're in business. And so in a way for us, the fact that teaching at the right level has persisted through some of these major shocks signals a level of institutionalization that is really quite deep, actually. And it's not just that it is existing in a policy. It's not just that the MOU has been renewed. That's a very big deal. As Megan says, policy matters, right? That's a huge deal, right? That's a level of commitment. But there's been efficacy over time. And for us, that's actually the holy grail. We're a results-oriented, evidence-based organization. But for us, this is a really big deal. So it's not just a thing that exists in theory. It's actually happening year in, year out, shock 1, shock 2. And it's working year in, year out, shock 1, shock 2. So for us, that's really the holy grail. And we wanted to just leave with that thought. So thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity. We've really benefited from the frameworks and lessons coming out of this really group of experts, and it's a real treat to share some of our recent experience. So thank you, everyone.
Wonderful, Noam. Thanks so much to you and Sheppy. Yeah, I'll call out a couple of things I see as similar. I mean, I think what we see from the Young Love example, similar from Educate, is that they have direct models, and then they also have kind of these government partnerships models. I think it's interesting about the Young Love models too is that they've mobilized, in addition to the teachers, these national youth service programs as like an implementer of the program. And I think it's important for both these examples to kind of keep in mind that they're both trying to integrate curriculum and pedagogy into the existing school day. So like, I think that's kind of a similar part of their model as well. And so I'm going to pose 2 questions, and then I would love to encourage you guys we've got wonderful questions from Anne, Carol, Idalia, June, Zadia in the chat. So if you guys could also, begin to peek at those, and I'll next ask you to kind of go one by one to respond to those. But the question I have is coming back to comment after Megan's presentations, it does seem to me that like ongoing teacher development and support is essential for mainstreaming innovation through government systems. And a question of like, who does this? I'd just be curious about like what we heard from Megan that the district person might not be the right person. So like just very briefly, because I'm sure you can speak a lot about that, like who do you think does this? And then a second question, which more broadly is that when you look across any dimension about like, what do you think is like the biggest challenge / opportunity for institutionalization, say in the coming 2 to 3 years? like what is it and what are you going to try to do and how are you going to try to track it, just to kind of get a sense of your learning and progress over time. And then we'll ask you to respond to some of the questions. I know we're slated to wrap up at 15 minutes past. If I could steal some extra time from the presenters to maybe go to 30 minutes to ask, it'll give us a little bit of time to dig into some of these questions. And I appreciate that folks may need to drop off, and this will be online on the Scaling Up website, and we'll share a link with all the participants, the recorded video of it. So maybe Megan, to you, could you tackle these two questions, and we'll pass over to Sheppy and Noam, and then we'll ask you guys to dip into the chat so far, and then if we have time, we'll look at hands raised before Larry closes us up. Megan, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. And also thanks, Noam and Sheppy. That was a fantastic presentation. When we think about ongoing teacher support, I think there are some areas where we're not entirely sure what actor is going to be the best at doing this on an ongoing basis. So I think that is something that, as we figure out how to lean into really making sure that the ownership happens in the government systems that exist, that's something I think we're focused on. One of our clear key champions is the person who's overseeing teacher training and professional development in the Rwanda Education Board. So I think that's been really helpful. Like, we do have that person as a partner. But I think one thing that we've realized is that head teachers play a really important role. And so whatever structure we land on, we need to make sure that there's a role not only to support teachers, but help head teachers be, or the role of the Dean of Students or DOS, actually reinforce that curriculum, because they're the people who are on the ground in the school all the time, who are really there, who can be the support. One thing that we've toyed with is we used in the first iteration of the program, the training was delivered through an existing role called the district master trainers. And those teachers were sort of district level people who were charged with doing training for all the schools in a district. That, I think, was really great because there was an existing structure, but there was some movement away from that. We also have been thinking about how can we use early adopters as potential, not parallel structure, but that could provide that structure. So we've been experimenting with a few different actors. I don't know that we have a perfect answer, except that we are really committed to making sure that it's somebody in the system and that it's not seen as an educate initiative, because that means that just no one owns it. And also that head teachers really are an important role. And then, John, you have to forgive me, I got part of your second question, sort of what's next on institutionalization.
Yeah, I did to focus on one thing in the next 2 years. A challenge you think is going to be a linchpin. What would that thing be, and how do you track it?
Great. Yeah. So I think for us, it's the assessment work. I think that is the key incentive in our in the system or in the context that we're working in. I know there were some questions around sort of that. How do we manage that and make sure it doesn't just kind of reinforce the existing kind of teach to the test structure? But I think getting that right, making sure that the teachers feel equipped to both assign these more continuous, active, practical assessments, as well as making sure that there is a system for passing that information up and down, that the policies and the sort of accountability structures are clear. That's, I think, where we're really leaning in. And there will be some training involved in that. So I think through answering the assessment question and tracking sort of what are the policy changes, what are the structures, and what does that training and reform rollout support look like, we'll answer a lot of other questions that could be useful with just the general pedagogy adoption training. Or we will hopefully answer the questions. As Noam says, up and down, but you want to trend towards positive.
Over to Young Love colleagues. Thanks, Megan.
Yeah, I'll take the who, Tepe, if you don't mind taking the quite tough one on what's next. What are we leading into? So a quick one on the who. One thing that was really fascinating, the Deputy Permanent Secretary said to us from day one, actually, the deputy said we cannot ask teachers to do this from day one, actually, because they, already they're so overwhelmed, they're so stretched, they're so underpaid. So if we say teachers, like, can you do this? They're actually going to rebel. Like, it's not going to go well as the ministry. So that's very interesting to see the ministry's own challenges within its own setup of how to create buy-in. Let alone us as an NGO. The ministry didn't want to say, teachers, please do another thing, right? Even if it's very similar. And in fact, we've had some very interesting experiences where sometimes we've posted the exact same advertisement when people say this is exploitation, and when we post it, people say how exciting. So actually there's a lot of internal dynamics in the ministry which are very important to navigate, and sometimes we can be a really strong partner for the ministry. And in particular, what they wanted, I think this is so interesting, is they did not want this to be top down. They wanted it to be bottom up. And so what they requested, go into the schools and deliver this any way you can, actually, any way we can. Right? Whether it's facilitators that you're bringing in, whether it's engaging whoever in the school is willing to do it. If it's an English teacher who wants to teach maths, let them do it. Whoever is willing and wants to, show it works, and then if it works, people will request it. Then we'll do a big training. I thought this was just such brilliant foresight on the part of the ministry, and it's worked so well. So this was delivered in 10% of schools. Then the ministry announced it at a national school heads meeting. And Botswana is actually a very small country, so you could fit every school head, this is pre-COVID, into one room, 700, 800 school heads. And then the ministry said, this is now a national rollout. And then 10% of hands in the room went up and said, I testify, this works, this works. And so it was just this kind of wildfire, everyone wanted it. But I think it's very interesting. The sequence of events is very important and interesting. I guess it speaks to this kind of early adopter point I think Megan just raised, of create demand for this and let it be the bottom-up grassroots demand meeting the supply, the policy, the framework, the high-level training. But if it's just a trickle down, the ministry said that's never going to work. So I think that's really interesting. And so we're really taking quite an experimental approach to figuring out, who's going to be the implementer now, who will be the implementer in a little bit, and how do we kind of build up actually, rather than carbon copy. So that's one thought set of thoughts around the who. Tepi, over to you on the what's next.
Yeah, thank you so much, Noam. I would say that, we are playing very much a key role in providing technical assistance with government on the monitoring, evaluation and learning side. We've been able to, coach and train government to collect data, but also ensure that they're really using data for action within their schools, but also, within the region and eventually headquarters. So very much, that's what we have been centrally focused on as an organization, to provide that level of support. But I think for where we would want to move and go is to be able to see this now integrated within the government, fully integrated within the government systems, where government are equipped to be able to do their own evaluations and learning, but again, also very much through a trickle effect. This is at regional level, and eventually at school level. So we see this as the next, goal or ambitious goals that we want to be able to reach on, to be able to see this, transferred strongly within government systems. And now, the question becomes, which you just posed, John, who do we see, to be able to be the player to do this within the government system? So that's what is currently, the discussions, but also where we would also want to move towards.
Thank you both so much. I think what I'd like to do is give you, Megan, I'll turn to you first, and I hope you had a chance to look at some of these questions that have come in. And why don't you respond to some of the key themes? Heather's added a question, and so has Ian. So maybe I'll give you like 5 minutes or so, if you could kind of address some of these key themes, and then we'll pass over to the Young Love colleagues for 5 minutes, and then over to Larry for the last 3 minutes for a close.
Great, sounds good. So it seems like from the questions, there were some key themes around the demand of the government and the partnership with the government actors, and then also thinking about the generalizability of our experience. And then I can dive into some of the more specific topic areas. But one of the things that we benefited from in this, in our experience in Rwanda, is that when we got involved in 2015, the broad curriculum reform to reform the entire country's education system curriculum was already well underway, and it was already going to happen in 2016. And so that, I think, for an organization like Educate of our size, was something that we realized, like, if a policy reform is already underway, or the reform of the entrepreneurship curriculum or some other curriculum that we can attach to is part of a broader curriculum reform, that's kind of a necessary precursor for us getting involved at this point, because if it's just one subject, it's the chances of having the system structures there that you can tap into, and also the chances of it just being too small and getting sort of pushed off the priority list is too large. So I think the existing government reform that was in line with the type of changes that we wanted to make was something that was really important in this context. And so, you know, there's always some risks with that when you're involved in even a larger, like, more political reform. But I think that is something that for us, it communicates demand in the government. The government's interested in making this change, and also allows us to have some sort of certainty that the investment that we make is going to actually result in some sort of change. I think also when we think about you know, policy is important is one of the things that has come out of this for us. You know, in Rwanda, I think we benefit from the fact that the national policy and the Rwanda Education Board is kind of able to kind of push that out, and the sort of organizational culture within that educational line management structure is such that what's in the curriculum does matter. But we know that that's not enough. And so when we're thinking about the curriculum reform being underway, we also have to think about, like, are they going to change the policy? Yes, but what sort of appetite is there for doing something outside of just changing things on paper? The partnership with REB, I think, outside of just tapping into an existing curriculum reform, for us, you know, we were invited to join, which I think was helpful. That was kind of the best way for them to communicate demand for us, which was really, really great. And we were able to kind of build upon work that other organizations were already doing, not just in the broad curriculum reform, but even within entrepreneurship subjects. So Akazi Kanozi Access, EDC, like all organizations like that were already involved in helping making sure the entrepreneurship curriculum was strong. And so when we got there, the things that we need to focus on was not everything, but just sort of pedagogy, student business clubs, and assessment. And since then, it's been really important for us to have a close working relationship with them. For the first year or two, we actually had an office in REB, which was really helpful. I think, you know, maintaining close contacts, even when there's turnover in the system, I think has been really beneficial for us in terms of maintaining that strong relationship. And again, this is, I think, where that point where we talk about, you know, you might not always have a policy, you might not always have a structure that you can point to as success, but being a resource for your government partners is also something where, like, that's an intermediate step that really needs to, that really helps you. And then when you think about generalizability, again, I mentioned, like, we need a curriculum reform. If there's a national curriculum that does translate into what happens in school, that is super helpful. For us, we know that incentives are huge, and thinking about the incentives within the system is something that is really important in parallel to the policy. So I think when we think about generalizability, we might be in a unique context in Rwanda. Every country is a unique context, but the things that do kind of remain constant across is kind of the relative importance of a national curriculum, and also knowing that just changing the paper, while it is a necessary, like you said, John's first step, it's not sufficient, and you have to think about what are the other system incentives and the levers that you can pull. I think I'll stop there. There were a couple other really great questions, but maybe I'll pass it to Young Love to speak a bit.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll pass to Young. I do think that that's a, you know, as we think about systems change and we think about institutionalization, I do think it's a fair point that you know, it's one thing, you know, in Rwanda and Botswana are probably two education systems in sub-Saharan Africa, which might be somewhat more straightforward in many respects in terms of government capabilities to do this in other contexts. And so I think that's a helpful point. What may be possible in these countries may not be as possible in many others. But over to our Young Love colleagues.
Yeah. Well, one thought on that, actually. So I think that's definitely true. I will say, in the status quo, Botswana's learning levels are way lower than Kenya's learning levels, actually. And I think that highlights the point that this is not actually about inputs and resources, because Botswana is much richer, for sure. And is really good at the inputs, good at building buildings, good at sending textbooks into the school, but the learning levels are, I mean, dramatically lower than Kenya, actually, as an example. Now, Kenya is a leader in the region, but still. And so I actually think this kind of emphasizes the point that the resource, dumping more resources into this is not actually the solution. And actually, it is something a bit more fundamental about pedagogy, teaching, learning. And I actually think those lessons are more generalizable, I would say, and means they can be replicated in other countries. But certainly, there's also, there's a robust national service program. It's funded. So definitely there's those, there's those unique context specific features, but I think it is more generalizable than it might at first appear. Two quick comments on this would be, there's so many great questions. Thank you so much, everyone, I kind of want to, I actually want to double the time of this session. This is so wonderful. But I would say one is, I think there's nothing like data as fuel. I think it's just fuel for a system. Visible data, I think one of the biggest problems with learning is it's so invisible. It's measured so infrequently. It's measured in these really weird metrics like 70 out of 100. What is that? I don't really know what that means. I mean, even like these SACMEX scores, 412, like how do you link that to action, right? And so saying, oh, kids don't know 2 plus 2, like you should teach 2 plus 2 tomorrow in the classroom. It's such fuel for the system. It shows you when progress is happening, when it isn't, what you can do. I think there's getting good actionable data into the system is so critical. So that's one point, and that's something we're really working on really taking to the next level. The other point I would say is, I actually think, I think there was this question like, what is robust to these shocks that happen? I actually do think that data is one of those, because it's not saying it's not prescriptive. It's not saying you should do X, but it gives you the tools to assess what to do. So in that sense, it's very flexible, like a bridge. A bridge is not rigid. It's sort of flexible, so it can kind of bounce. And so I think data is that. It's sort of enough structure that it helps you react, but it's not so rigid. Like when something shakes, it breaks. So I think that's one. The other is, I do think this demand piece. I think, like, for example, one of our top regional directors, she retired, and wonderful. She's sort of been there for 40 years. She should retire, right? But that's a big threat to the whole thing, because there's nothing like a good regional director. Well, thankfully, the mayor was on board because they'd been to the school and they had seen the program and they loved it and their constituents liked it. And, this one school head was super motivated. So they actually helped bring on board the next regional director. So I think actually, in a way, demand is actually quite robust and hard to shake. I actually think sometimes the sort of leadership, that can, when someone retires, it can really be a death knell. But if you've got that demand, I think keeps it going. In addition to the MOU, of course, you got to have that MOU or that document. And they're like, oh, we've got the MOU, we're supposed to do this. So that combination, very powerful.
Excellent. Seppi, can you share final thoughts from your side, maybe like in a minute or two before we hand over to Larry?
Thank you so much, Megan and Noam. I would agree very much with your sentiments, but also just to share on the question about the motivation on signing the MOU. We had embarked on the proof of concept journey initially with the ministry. We saw, promising results, but also when you enter a teaching at the right level classroom, you find students sitting on the floor, not scared to raise up their hands and very much learning in a fun way. So we very much, that was the motivation. But again, looking at the declining test scores. So not only at primary level are, we not making progress in terms of learning, but also you find that in junior and secondary school, still the challenge. So there was a big push from the ministry to really take this seriously and for us to do something about it. And hence why we have really, maintained a strong partnership, for over the years. So there's huge demand, but also, again, there's a need that's more pressing and urgent. Therefore, the ministry I would like to engage, but all is to say that there has been such an interesting discussion, and we wish that we could continue. But also, thank you so much for the questions.
Excellent, Larry. Over to you to bring it all home.
Well, first of all, thanks to you all for a really delicious discussion, and that was just great. And I agree with Noam that we could keep going for another hour and a half and not even break a sweat on this. So thanks so much for doing that. I want to just end with a couple of points, mostly pointing the way to the future. And I'll start with something that's implicit in what you all have been saying, but I think it's really important to articulate, which is I think as a community, we're realizing there's a big gap between government concurrence and government ownership. And in a world that for a long time was dictated by a kind of a donor-driven model of things, if something wasn't positively a negative possibility, or if it had any promise whatsoever of being useful, I think governments got in the habit of saying yes. So the reflexive position was yes to a variety of things, but yes, I think was mistaken by a lot of us as being more than it is. It was a kind of a passive yes. And moving from that to a sense that we're supporting something that they want to do, and we're finding a way as a third party to be useful, occasionally in stimulating it, often in supporting and giving thrust to it, I think is a big change of heart on our part, and even more on the part of the people who often fund us to do the things that we do. So I think there's a big gap still to be filled between what ownership really means and what form it takes and what some of the prerequisites and key elements are in doing that. And I think the two examples we looked at today were just really stunning examples of genuine, heartfelt efforts to do exactly that. The second thing I wanted to say is that in order to do that, I think we need to elevate our level of professionalism in talking about institutionalization to be more or less comparable to our level of professionalism when we talk about efficacy or when we talk about coverage. We know how to talk about those things. We have a vocabulary, we have standards, we know how to set objectives, we know how to measure progress, we know what the interventions need to be to make it happen. We're not nearly as adroit in talking about institutionalization. And so my hope for this series on the part of this working group is that we begin to, again, close that gap. And the intention in all that is to, as I mentioned at the beginning, to have this discussion today about the issue in general, but particularly focused on education, to have one in about a month that's similar in structure, but focused on health, with the implicit question being, is health different than education, or is it the same lesson learned from another perspective? Then to turn the entry point from people like yourselves who are coming from the NGO side of this or from the intervener side to looking at it what from the donor perspective, and finally from the government perspective, and then see, rather than just have a collection of observations, if we can really pull that together into something that's a knowledge product for our community and for the larger community. It's a high bar we set for ourselves. Even if we only share experiences like we did today, I think it's hugely valuable. But the aspiration is something even a notch beyond that. So I want to thank you all for getting us off to such a great start in doing exactly that. And I guess it's mine to close, even though, John, I want to thank you for all you did in putting this together as a session. We had the foresight to record this, and I'm glad we did, because some of the people who were with us at the beginning were unable to stay to the end. But anybody who didn't stay to the end missed something important, and I hope we can get it back out to everyone who did participate and the number of people who wish they had and would have benefited from it. So thank you all so much for what I thought was a great session. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
everyone. Bye.
Great. Bye-bye.